I've spent most of my life being a plumber. About 40 years ago, I'd been a Christian all my life, pretty much, and I decided to study the Christianity from a secular viewpoint, and just to see if I felt it was true. And after just reading one book, I decided I didn't believe it anymore. So I dropped out of that faith and went into no man's land, atheism. So, but I kept studying the historical Jesus because I find it so interesting. Whenever I go for a drive by myself, I'm thinking about that. When I'm taking showers, I'm thinking about that. Every time I have spare time, just think about the historical Jesus, trying to do math calculations. Math is an amazing thing. If you add math to your history work, then you have something solid, right? Like history is about probabilities, right? You could never say anything about the past for sure, right? Probably, even if you said what you had for breakfast yesterday, you probably cannot say with 100% surety what you had for breakfast. That was just 24 hours ago, because you might, you just might have bad memory or whatever. So trying to go back 2,000 years ago and say what happened, I mean, that's like ridiculous, right? The probabilities, we're not really talking about what happened. We're talking about what's the probability that something happened. So if you could add math to it, though, math tells you what the probability is, and then when you know what the probability is, like if it's really strong or really weak, then you could make an educated decision about if you think the thing really happened. So that's what I tried to do. It's been 33 years of the last 37, studying the historical Jesus, adding math to the situation, and my friend Mark Petrosky helped me a lot on that, using math and adding math in, so I want to thank you publicly for that, Mark. Thank you. So, yeah, we're going to do a little review. In the second video you'll see on YouTube, the question is titled, "Who was Jesus' father?" So I've already presented the strongest argument I could mathematically on who Jesus' father was. Trying to link Jesus' family to this other guy, Judas of Galilee, to his family, actually is not that hard of a thing to do. Just real quick on Judas of Galilee. His father was Hezekiah, a guerrilla fighter in the year 50 BCE in the hills of Syria. He would attack Roman soldiers and villages and stuff, and a guerrilla fighter, basically trying to bring the kingdom of God back to Palestine, back to Judea. So the Romans were against him, of course, and Herod, he wasn't the king at the time yet. He was just a military leader. He captured him, had his head cut off without going through the Torah, without going through the law, and there was a national protest about this. The mothers it wasn't just Hezekiah that got his head chopped off, but other soldiers, and the mothers of these soldiers made a protest. The news, it's funny when you say news, you're thinking newspapers, right? That's what I'm thinking. No, but word of mouth news spread throughout the country. Everybody knew about this guy Hezekiah and about the bad Herod and what he had done to him. And he had a son named Judas. But the mother of Judas could not tell anybody that this Judas was the son of Hezekiah, because it's like telling, let's say your dad is Benedict Arnold, right? Would you want to go around telling people who your dad was, right? So if your dad was Hezekiah, you could not tell anybody. You would easily, the Romans, if they knew that you were the son of this guy, they probably would sell you into slavery. So they had to keep that secret. So this guy grows up knowing who his dad is, but not being able to tell anybody. So that's Judas of Galilee. And the thought is, if you look at these guys' names, just looking at their names, it looks like they might be somehow related to the Jesus names, right? You got Hezekiah, Judas, and then he had 4 sons, James, Simon, Menahem, Jair. Jair's actually, there's a guy named Jair in the New Testament. You might want to check him out someday. With his son Lazarus. It's in Josephus. This all comes out of the writings of Josephus. And in Josephus, he doesn't use the word Lazarus, but Lazarus is the same name. He uses the name Eliezer. And so it's the same name as Lazarus. That's the Judas of Galilee's family. And here's the Jesus family. We have Joseph, which if you watch the second video, you'll see how that Joseph had an alias, right? His alias was Alphaeus, and Joseph married Mary, and they had Jesus, who married Mary Magdalene later on. Jesus' twin brother, Thomas. Thomas means twin. His first name was Judas. That also is out of the second video. Then they had other brothers named James, Joseph, Simon. You recognize that Judas and James and Simon again? Matthew. And this guy's partner is Matthew. So these names are repeating. And then Bartholomew. Bartholomew means Bart. Any scholar will tell you, every scholar will tell you this. They say that name means Bar-Tome, son of Tome. But listen to how the name Tome sounds like Tome. And this guy's name is like the transliteration of this guy's name. Right? Bartome is the transliteration of Tome. So to me, I'm thinking that these are the same, that this guy, Judas Thomas was the father of this guy. If you look at, you can do the math on it, it's there's a 4% chance that there was even a Tome in near these guys, right? 4%. But there's 100% chance that there was a Thomas near these people. So anyway, if you can compare those two things. But this is Judas of Galilee's family, and here's Jesus' family. And so it looks to me like they have something in connection, that there's some way that they're connected. Now, you could do the math on it, and just to demonstrate, I'll just do it quickly. There's about 1 million people living in Judea at that time, first century. Out of all million people, there's only 4 people that claimed to be the king or the Messiah. That was this guy, Judas, his son Menahem, and Jesus, plus another guy named Athrongus. So those only had 4. The historian Josephus says there were many that claimed that, right? But he only names 4. So we only have 4 that are named, 4 individuals that are named that claim to be royal people or kings or messiahs. Then both families are from the same town, Sepphoris, Nazareth area. Both families have a guy named Judas in it, which is 7 out of 100. Both families have a guy named Simon in it, and a guy named James. Both families have the same teachings about the resurrection, and they both have the same actions: a triumphant procession and a cleansing of the temple. So if you did the math on that, if you multiply that out, you're going to find the odds of you finding even one family with all of those features, and then you square that, and you find the odds of there being 2. So the math shows overwhelmingly that the 2 families are connected somehow. And this, like I said, this is just a review, so I can't cover the whole thing. I'm almost out of time now. As it is it looks like what happened is this. Hezekiah dies, gets his head cut off. Judas grows up not telling anybody who his father is. Then he has to use aliases wherever he goes. When he's in Nazareth, he picks the alias Joseph, marries Mary, and has a bunch of kids. Kids, you know the story from the New Testament. When he's in Capernaum, when he's in Sepphoris, when he's in Nazareth, he goes by the name Joseph. When he's in Capernaum, he goes by the name Alphaeus. So that's what he did, it looks like. And let's see. That was a review. Wow. It took more than half of my time. Let's see. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Judas of Hezekiah. It looks like he was trained by the Essenes, and we might hear a little bit about that from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some people argue that the Essenes wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so it looks like he was trained by them. And he was a very popular rabbi, like I said. He led the protest against the golden eagle. And then what he did was, now what happened with the golden eagle, Herod had placed on the main entrance to the temple a graven image of an eagle covered with gold. And that was offensive to the max against the Jewish people. And when the news hit to the students of the two rabbis, the two famous rabbis working in Jerusalem, it was Judas and Matthew. Those are popular rabbis. When the news hit the students that Herod was about to die, that he was very sick, Judas said to them, if you want a legacy, no one lives forever. But if you want a legacy, you want to do something for God, let's tear down that golden eagle. Your legacy is going to live on forever. If we don't do something like this, we'll all die eventually. You'll get old, you'll get sick, you'll be dead, and you'll be forgotten. But if you want to do something for God, God might work with you, might keep us. God might do a miracle, maybe save us from the Romans, maybe not. Maybe we'll just give our lives. But that will give you a chance to do something for God. And so they did. They went out there, they chopped it down. You can look this up in Josephus. They chopped down the golden eagle middle of the day, and they get arrested. The Romans captured Matthew, burned him at the stake. They captured several students. They captured 40 students. They burned everybody at the stake who had climbed up on the temple and used their axes and stuff to knock the thing down. All those people got burned at the stake. Everyone else just got killed. Meanwhile, while that was happening, Judas of Galilee and the rest of the students escaped, and they made their way all the way back to Sepphoris. Now, unfortunately, he had taken the name Judas, son of Sepphoris, because he had to use a last name. Well, not a last name. He had to use a moniker, right? So he had taken the name Judas, son of Sepphoris, when he was not wanted by the Romans. And now he is wanted by the Romans, and they could easily find out where he's going. Because if you're a fugitive, right? You're a fugitive, you break the law, and you escape from the control of the police forces. If they know where you lived, they know where you're going, because you need to get home, collect as much money as you can from your friends, and buy a car and go to Mexico or whatever. So they know that the Roman soldiers know he would be going to Sepphoris, and he had loved ones in Sepphoris, right? So he had to get up there as fast as he could and get his loved ones and get them out of the town before the Romans got there, because the Romans, back then, those people, they knew what the Romans were like. Another time, the Romans had a rebellion had happened throughout the country. The Romans came in, and they did an investigation throughout the country, captured 2,000 rebels, supposedly. Probably captured them by using torture, to get people to tell on each other. Anyway, captured 2,000 of them and strung them up, crucified them throughout the country. And Judas knew what the Romans were like. So he knew he had to get there. So he gets up there as quick as he can. He got there before the Romans did. And the news hit that Herod had died. And so the people in the town revolted against the Romans. That was a thing that happens a lot of times in history. Hank's shaking his head. He's a historian, a bit of a historian. So, when the king dies, you revolt, right? So the king died, the news hit the town that the king died, and so the people revolted. Judas, son of Sepphoris, took his people and attacked the armory, got the weapons, armed themselves. The rest of the townspeople, not the whole town, but whoever it was in the town that was rebelling, attacked the palace. So Judas takes his men that are armed now and forces the rest of the people all to form a big militia. And Josephus says he was strong against them, right? He probably used force. So he creates a militia. And then what happens is they know, so they basically have freed the town of Roman control. But they know the Romans aren't going to just let it take that line down. And the news it's going to take about a week, 4 days, to get up to Damascus where the Roman legions were, and then they were going to march down. And they knew this, and so they knew they had to do something to be safe. and get their loved ones out of the town. And if the men wanted to stay and fight the Romans, fine. If they didn't, fine. But they had to get all their loved ones, anybody who couldn't fight, they had to get them out of the town because the Romans were coming. So, let's see. So, yeah, this is the basic argument for how these two families are connected. And if you watch the second video, you'll see that the connection most likely is that this guy Judas is the same guy as this guy who has aliases. Judas was a man of several aliases. He spends the rest of his life having aliases, and you'll see that it's most likely that guy. Thus, this guy being the same person, Jesus' father is known as Judas of Galilee in the history books. Okay? So that's the basic argument. And the cool thing about this, the cool thing about studying history for me is that they say when you find the truth, then things start falling into place. Right? So my last few minutes, I want to talk about the things that sort of have fallen into place since this argument has been brought forward in my brain. One of them is toponyms. Both Judas son of Sepphoris and Jesus of Nazareth, right? They have a toponym. They have a name that has a location in it, right? So both of them, it would make sense that this guy is Jesus' father because just like Judas could not tell anybody who his father was, if this guy was Jesus' father, Jesus also cannot tell anybody who his father is. So they called him Jesus of Nazareth instead of Jesus son of Joseph, Jesus son of Alphaeus, or Jesus son of Judas of Galilee, especially Jesus son of Judas of Galilee. That would be totally unsafe to do. An interesting thing, this guy, Judas of Galilee, he names this is his first family, 4 sons, we don't know how many daughters, 1 grandson. Then he starts a whole other family. So the first family lived in Sepphoris, second family over there lives in Nazareth, and it looks like he had a third family, but in his second family, he names his sons after the sons of his first family, which sort of makes sense if you think about it. You are a criminal, you're running from the Romans, your name can never be spoken again safely in your hometown. If anybody calls you by that name, the Romans hear you or anybody else hears that conversation, you might get arrested and sold into slavery or tortured or burned at the stake like your partner. So your name can never be spoken again, along with the names of your children. So his oldest son would be James, next son Simon. Those names had to disappear, never to be spoken again. So what does he do? He starts another family in Nazareth, right next door, and then he names his sons Judas, James, Simon, and Matthew after his first partner, Matthew, who got burned at the stake. So when I started putting these together, it's like, it makes sense. That's what a person would do. A person that was bold, right? A person that was really fearful would not recreate all those names. But he did. He recreated all the names that were basically forbidden. Let's see. One thing about, another thing that really seemed to, another piece of the puzzle that seemed to come together was that this guy was a nationally known rabbi, famous rabbi. This guy is today a nationally known famous rabbi, right? You cannot name another, no one can, because there's all the records, there's no other nationally known famous rabbi in the first half of the first century, except this guy, that guy, and the guy this guy was named for, Matthew, burned at the stake. Those are the 3 guys, right? So that's kind of cool to see that. Also, it would make sense that if you're a nationally known famous rabbi, you can speak Greek, you can read, you can write, and guess what? You might be tempted to teach your children those things, right? So that knowledge that this guy had, right, was passed down because he raised this guy. He raised Jesus. So it would make totally sense. Everybody says, where did Jesus get all his knowledge? Like that's even in the New Testament. Somebody just said, where did you get all your knowledge? Well, where he got him was for a man he could not say his name. He got him from Judas, looks like, right? people always say, can Jesus read? And they would say, no, Jesus could never read because he's like a poor person up from the hills. But it looks like he could easily have been taught to read by his father, along with James. James, there's supposed to be a Gospel of James. Scholars will say, nah, it wasn't written by James. It wasn't written by this guy because this guy couldn't read. How do you know he couldn't read? Maybe he was the son of, he could read if he was the son of that guy because he probably was taught to read along with Peter and some other ones. So let's see. Great teacher. Both of these guys their main focus was the kingdom of God, establishing the kingdom of God. This one was, the focus was a literal kingdom of God. This one, the scholars will say, it was like a metaphorical kingdom of God. It was a spiritual kingdom of God. I don't know. To me, the case hasn't been proven that. It looks like the case to me, it feels like he was for the literal kingdom of God also. But the case hasn't been proven. I guess we'll end with this thing. So he takes over Sepphoris, right? He takes over Sepphoris. He's the provincial governor now, the rebel leader of the whole. Sepphoris was the capital of the whole province, so he's in charge. And they said he was like kind of rough with the people, or he was kind of hard. So it looks like he looted. What they normally would do would loot the rich people's houses. And it was actually, you'd think that's immoral, but it's moral if they, in your mind, if you're a Jew living back then, or Judean, I should say, and the Holy Scriptures. The Holy Scriptures say every 50 years is supposed to be a year of Jubilee where everything is given back, right? Everybody, all the land is given back to the original owners of 50 years ago. So that was never, there's no time in history that ever took place, the year of Jubilee. So the rich people did not ever give the land back. They just kept getting richer and richer. And so that's the story about. So if you're a rebel leader, you could loot a rich person's house and not feel guilty about it because you're like collecting on the taxes that they never paid for decades or thousands of years, at least hundreds of years. So this guy would have had, if he looted all these rich people's homes, he would have had a ton of stuff that he wanted to convert to weapons so he could fight the Romans, but there wasn't time. Right? So what's he going to do with all of this treasures, also taken from the palace? He has truckloads of treasure. What's he going to do with it? Well, remember, Josephus said he's a clever person. He only names like 2 people that are like clever like that in the whole country for the whole first century. Clever person. So if I was me, right? If I'm a really smart person and I got a load of stuff that I gotta like sell to, I could turn into something I want. And also I have to go into hiding now because the Romans came down, they marched down, they took Sepphoris, burned it, a third of it down, and he had to go flee. So if I were him, what I would have done was taken it and traveled to Edessa and India and trade it for things that I could sell. Like you basically, money laundering, right? You're money laundering. So that's what I would have done. And that's we don't know if he did that, but later on his sons go to India and Edessa, the grandson goes to Edessa, and they had connections with kings over there. So it might be that this guy, with all the loot, when he had to flee the Romans, spent some time going to India and Edessa, trading that loot for things that could be legal, that could be traded safely, and then go back and forth between the 2 places. And the last thing I'll say about that is his name that he used in the corner of the country closest to Edessa and Bethsaida and Capernaum, the name that he had there meant traverse, trade, exchange. So that's the name he took. That's about all the evidence we have that he did this thing, but that's about all that we can say about that. I ran out of time 4 minutes ago. So, man, this is mostly just a review. So what I'm going to do is we'll go ahead and do any questions and answers. And, thanks. Thank you. So anybody with a question or an answer? Vic. Oh, yeah, hold it.
Yeah, That's okay. I don't think I need it. You can hear me, right?
But not for the tape, though.
Oh, for the tape. Oh, God, sorry. Okay. Why would these people go all the way to India to trade? Why? Because I mean, the Persian Empire wasn't Roman.
Right.
Why didn't they go to the Persia?
So maybe they just went to Edessa. Edessa would be one of the biggest towns that was out of Roman control and closest to Judea. So maybe they just went to Edessa. That's probably where they went. But if you're a trader and you can make, let's say he became a trader, like his name, it sounds like he was, then you might go back and forth to India also. The money was in, you make the longer the trip, you make more money usually, that kind of thing. Anybody else?
What was Herod's ethnic background? Was he Palestinian, Roman? What was he?
So you probably can answer this better than I can. So correct me if I got this wrong, his father, I think, was Idumean. It was, his father, I think, one of his parents came from a place, I think was over around this area, and the Jew, it was basically, they called him like a half-Jew, but on his father's side. So if you're going to be a Jew, you want to be Jew on the mother's side, not your father's side. And so basically he's considered at the best half Jewish. Anybody else?
Yeah, mine's a little like his question. In the state of Kerala in southern India, 25% of the population is Christian, and they say that they were all converted by Thomas when he went there. And some people don't believe it, and some people do believe that, and I just wondered what your opinion on that is.
Sure. So to me, there's some miracles related to what Thomas supposedly did in India. So I don't personally believe in miracles, but the rest about going to India, like why can't someone go to India? That was the traders. That's what they did. They went back and forth. If you're a trader or your dad's a trader or whatever, that's what you do. So yeah, I think he went to India. There's evidence that he did go there, and there's no evidence that he didn't go there. Like there's no place that says Thomas went to like Rome and died in Rome, and that he went directly from Palestine to Rome and died there. So there's no evidence. No, there's no contrary evidence on it. So I would say yes. Anyone else? Okay, Vic.
What is the evidence that these prominent rabbis that we're talking about were trained by the Essenes?
So let's see here. Both Essenes and the Christians that I shouldn't use the word Christians, the followers of Jesus, the disciples. Oh, that's gonna fall. All right, the disciples. Yeah, both of them had 12 disciples. The government of both was the same in terms of having 3 people, like the main people in charge, and then there was a group of 12 that was also like in charge. Ricky might correct me on some of these things. Both of them had, had Judas got early training. Let's say you were the mother of Judas and you have to hide your son. One of the best places to hide him is give him to the Essenes. Essenes would take him and train him. Right? So that would explain where he got all that training from. And then also, if he's really bright, like this guy was, and then he could work his way up as a rabbi, becomes a rabbi, and gets the best spot to be, the most powerful spot to be. The best speakers would go to Jerusalem, of course, right? So that would explain why when Josephus says people came from the whole nation to hear him speak, well, the Essenes went to Jerusalem all the time. Right? So they would go there and hear him speak. So that explains 2 things that Josephus says about him. The other thing is that there's all kinds of connections seemingly about the 12 disciples and the Essenes. Like, for example, the wearing of linen. Right? In the New Testament, it talks about this youth that was captured that was wearing linen. Essenes wore linen. James also, who became the leader of the first the Christian church, he wore linen. So there's that. Yeah, that's all I've written down here. But there's other things. You can look it up, the connection between Essenes and Christianity, and there's a list. Now, the people who study that, they think it's like 50-50 basically, because there's similarities between the Essenes and Christianity, or let's say the Jesus movement. I shouldn't call it Christianity. There's similarities between the Jesus movement and the Essenes, and then there's things that they're the opposite of. About. Oh, we can just leave it there. Thanks. Any more questions? Hank?
There's another theory about the New Testament that I kind of like, and that it's a theory that says that the Romans wrote it because the Romans wanted the Jews to be sort of nonviolent taxpayers, and this is based on two teachings of Jesus. One in which he says, "Turn the other cheek," which indicates, passivity, and the other teaching is, he said, he took a coin, he said, "Give to God what is God, and give to Caesar what is Caesar's," meaning a coin. And so that's always been a theory that I kind of liked, and I was just wondering if there's any way that theory could fit into your theory.
Yeah, so what I've done on this 33-year trip, I've done this is the low-lying fruit. This is the easy stuff, right? This is like sixth grade math, right? Sixth grade math. This is just reading all the sources, putting this together. That's like the low-lying fruit. The difficult part is trying to figure out what Jesus said. So when the New Testament says Jesus said blank, 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 and like really? So how are you gonna prove that? So. First of all, we'd have to establish that he really said those things. And then from that, we'd go to the next thing. And so I don't think that Jesus was at all pro-Roman. I think he was like his father. And the next, I don't know if I'm going to have time, but it looks like these 12 disciples were involved in somewhat connected to a military operation against the Romans in Jerusalem, and that's what I'm going to be talking about in the future. So, we can't prove that he said those things, and so it's hard for me. I basically don't think that Jesus was at all pro-Roman. When that thing about this, your cheek and stuff, there's a thing where it says if somebody says go a mile, then you walk it 2 miles or whatever. That was actually a thing that you're supposed to do for Roman soldiers, right? Like if a Roman soldier, back then there was a law. If a Roman soldier says you have to walk a mile and show him someplace or take him someplace, you have to do that. So Jesus said, hey, if Romans, he didn't say supposedly, he didn't say the part about Roman soldier, but it was all pro-Roman stuff, really thick pro-Roman stuff. I pretty much doubt all of it. That's my opinion. Can't prove it. Anybody else?
What's the evidence that that Mary Magdalene was married to Jesus?
So there's a tomb called the Talpiot tomb, and in that tomb there are ossuaries, bone boxes, and one of them says Jesus, son of Joseph, and the other one has the names of these people in it, some of these people, right? And one of the ossuaries says Mary and Martha on it, and that ossuary is decorated a lot like Judas, son of Jesus' ossuary, and all the other ones are plain. So and then I've used, if we could talk privately because I don't have time, but use this same type of argument to argue that Mary and Martha were the same as the Mary and Martha in the New Testament, and then you use the same kind of argument that tells you that Mary and Martha fame is the same as Mary Magdalene, and then that pretty much gets you there. But I spent there's a whole 40-minute discussion on that, which I've already given, so right now I have to, yeah. No, they were two. Well, the New Testament says they're two sisters. So the ossuary would say Mary and Martha. That's the idea is that they were both buried and that they lived their life forever in that bone box. right? The New Testament says they were sisters, and then after they die, they lived their life together forever. Well, until it was found in 1980. But now their bones are all buried together too, so they're still together. So anyway, anybody else? Okay, well, thanks a lot, you guys. I really appreciate your attention and questions. I don't know what's more fun, answering the questions or giving the speech. So Joanna Foley's next, and I'm hoping that she will give a little bio about herself when she gets up here. And I'm going to turn over the meeting to her. Oh, what I wanted to do is give you guys some time, maybe how about 5 minutes? And you guys can, you want to chat amongst yourself. We call it officially discussion time. But we'll give you about 5 minutes while Joanna gets set up. And thanks for saying. After this will be Joanna Foley, about 5 minutes. Then Ricky Landis, about 5 minutes. And then Roger Houston, about 30 minutes or so. Great, thanks very much.
Hey, folks. Could I encourage you to get your supply of cookies or any other thing and come on back and take a look at this photograph? So this photo is related to our congregation's history. And so does anyone want to speculate about what the connection is? And there's certain people who are not allowed to answer. So this is our mother church. It looks really different from our present building, doesn't it? So just as the Live Oak Unitarian congregation in Alameda grew out of or split off from, whichever verb you will prefer, from the First Unitarian Church of Oakland, we, BFUU, grew out of or split off from the First Unitarian Church of Berkeley. So, and that happened in 1961, and the story of how we became separate congregations is long and complicated, and I don't even know all of the story, so I'm certainly not going to go into it tonight. Setting up a future speaking engagement, maybe. So, a leading figure in the founding of this church was Thomas Starr King. And he was the second minister of the First Unitarian Church of San Francisco. And he's kind of a leading light in West Coast Unitarianism because he did more than anyone else on the West Coast to keep California in the Union during the Civil War and free of slavery. He also spearheaded the founding of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which is today's Red Cross. And he was a speaker at the dedication of San Francisco's first public high school, and he served as a director of the College of California, which is the forerunner of Cal, the University of California. So when you hear the name Starr King today, what comes to mind? Exactly. It's one of two Unitarian seminaries. Harvard Divinity School used to be a Unitarian seminary, and it is no more. So Thomas Starr King was one of the founders of the school. It was originally called the Starr King School for Religious Leadership, which went on to become the seminary. And the church and the seminary worked very closely together in the early years. And the seminary served as a place where the seminarians, the future ministers, could practice their skills at giving sermons. And this is also true in more recent times, a relationship which we hope to cultivate again, even though the seminary now has a different geographic location. So the First Unitarian Church of Berkeley was founded on Sunday, July the 12th, 1891, in a space rented from the Berkeley Oddfellows Temple. And the first meeting was said to have taken place in a saloon. So, if that is true, that may be just a rumor, suitable quarters, or at least different quarters, were found for subsequent meetings. So, on that great Founders' Day, 32 charter members signed the membership book. And a few more signed the following week, and by the end of the year, membership was up to 50. Then, as now, there were as many who didn't sign as who did sign, Unitarians being Unitarians. So the total church family was approximately 100. The new church was of unique design, and like most Unitarian churches built since then, it symbolized the faith's difference from the more conventional mainstream churches. It was the creation of the architect A.C. Schweinfurth and Bernard Maybeck, who went on to become a very famous architect, was a member of the congregation, and it is possible, and worked in the same office as Schweinfurth. So it's possible that he contributed to the design. And it was an excellent early example of Bay Area shingle style, more commonly known for residences. The building was 40 feet square with a basement. And a member here remembers attending that church in her childhood, where she was impacted by the organ. An organ would have been really loud in a 40 by 40 space. And if you look closely at the photos, you see out front there are two pillars, which are actually redwood tree trunks. And those were donated by a member of the church. So the dedication was on November the 20th, 1898, at 3:30 p.m., with 4 Unitarian ministers and a rabbi participating. Opinion was divided as to its architectural beauty. One passerby was heard to say, "It looks like a powerhouse," meaning an electrical utility station, I think. And someone answered, "Well, of course, it is a powerhouse," meaning, spiritually. So there's a lot of history that I'm going to skip over, but I am going to talk about kind of the most important thing that I think this congregation has ever done. So early in the 1930s, the state of California was attempting to extend its control over the religious activities of its citizens that had begun in 1930 with the constitutional amendment and taxation of outside church income. Now, I've got to admit, ignorance, I don't know what constitutional amendment they're talking about there. But the first requirement here, they asked, the state was asking to have the Bible read 15 minutes a day in all classrooms. Is this sounding familiar? So the minister of the church advised the congregation that this law should be protested. It was, mingling church and state. So, continuing in this vein, in 1953, the California legislature passed the Levering Act, which required that all teachers and college faculties sign a loyalty oath, promising not to overthrow the Constitution of the state of California. And the choice was sign or be fired. And this was a reflection on the state level of the national thrust of McCarthyism and the Red Scare and the fear of communist influence in the arts and in politics and in education. I remember I actually faced a similar consequence when I worked in Illinois, and I was to be a part of an educational project there. And all of us were supposed to sign the Illinois loyalty oath that we were not going to overthrow the Constitution of that state. I didn't sign, and I was fired. So the churches were, in 1954, the churches were notified that ministers must sign the loyalty oath, or their churches would be subjected to additional taxation. And our church stood firm and refused to have the minister sign the loyalty oath and paid the tax. And then, with the cooperation of 3 other California churches, 2 of them Unitarian, took the matter to court, all the way to the Supreme Court, where all of the Levering Act was declared unconstitutional. And the taxes that had been paid were refunded with interest. And this was, I think, a major case of Unitarian leadership for the common good. So I think that's about my time. There's a lot more to be said, and I'm not joking about maybe speaking again, maybe filling out what I don't know about all this. Because I've basically, my source material for this was what's published online from UUCB, I used to call it our sister church. I guess it's our parent church up the hill. So that's all I have to say about our history, and I'm open to questions.
Just second artist, please.
'53, I believe, was when the Rosenbergs were executed. I was quite young.
Yeah, it's curious to me that Christians these days try to push that, like, 10 Commandments in the classroom and or praying in the classroom as some way to, like, stave off, like, Columbine-like situations or other, like, negative things, and that there's not, like, any, like, evidence, I think, that that is true. They're just kind of, like, coming up with a random claim about something being, like, efficacious. And so I guess I'm curious where this culture started. I mean, you mentioned the situation. Does it date back even earlier than that in terms of people pushing for the 10 Commandments for some sort of edification or some sort of positive, like, quality or effect?
That's a good question.
Oops, sorry.
That's a good question, Brett, and I really don't know the answer to it, but I wouldn't be surprised. In the earlier years in our country, which I'm more knowledgeable about than I am in this stuff, in the state of Virginia, people were fined if they had worship services in their home, and they were required to attend the established church. So, you know, the ongoing struggle about religious freedom versus religious political control has been around for a long time.
I read recently that the Unitarian Church of Oakland was built in 1890. So I'm curious when that congregation started and what its origin was.
I don't know the details on that, but I know that it was started earlier than this congregation. And they were cooperative and helpful and supportive in getting this congregation started. So Oakland was probably the first Unitarian church in this area. And I guess we would have been second. And I don't know who would have come after that. Oh, that's right, San Francisco. Yeah, it may be first, and Oakland may be second. Okay. Other questions?
Well, thank you so much, Joanna. It was really nice to hear all that stuff. I must be a lover of history because, you know, it's like, that's interesting stuff. Ricky Landis is next, going to talk to us about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Thank you so much, Ricky.
Hello. I am Jeff and Margaret's neighbor. I am not a historian, not a scholar, but I love history, and I read a book about the Dead Sea Scrolls and looked into it a little further, so he asked me to speak about it. If you have questions I don't know the answers to, I will happily get back to you. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in a cave first in 1947. The cave is in a place called Qumran, which is just west of the northern tip of the Dead Sea. And the people found them were Bedouin goat herders. They were looking for a goat. They threw a rock in a cave. They heard a shard break. And they went in and found pottery full of what looked like material fabric. Turned out they were scrolls all rolled up. So they took the scrolls to the village, and someone there took them to a town, and someone there took them to the city. Eventually, the scrolls were discovered, or the scholars realized that they were really, really remarkable and were real and were very, very old. It turns out that there are about fragments of about 900 skulls found in the various caves in the area. The caves were explored from about 1947 to 1957, although they are still being explored. It turns out something was found in a cave in the Judean desert. This is all the Judean desert, as recently as 2017. The scrolls that were found in that period, 47 to 57, date from approximately 300 BCE to approximately the 1st century CE. They are all Jewish in origin. There are no New Testament scrolls. There's nothing in the scrolls about Jesus or Christianity. They are a relic of a time that is pre-Christian, but there is nothing in them, although there was deep hope that there would be by Christian scholars, but there is nothing in them that is Christian. They are written on a variety of materials: leather, vellum, parchment, papyrus. One scroll is entirely made of copper, which is very unusual, and it apparently is a treasure map of some kind. I have not seen that one. Before the discovery of the scrolls, the earliest existing document of the Old Testament was an Old Testament written around 1000 CE, and it's called the Leningrad Codex, and it's in a museum in Russia. There was also a very large trove of documents found in around 1895 in an old synagogue in Cairo. It's called the Cairo Geniza. It's a collection, enormous, thousands of documents that people didn't want to throw in the garbage but didn't want to keep. So it's an enormous trove. And everything in the Cairo Geniza doesn't date any earlier than the 9th century CE. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are an incredible find. They are a trove of enormous wealth and value and scholarly value. There's about 3 types of documents in the Dead Sea Scrolls. About a quarter of the scrolls are Old Testament books or fragments from Old Testament books. Every single book in the Old Testament is represented in the Dead Sea Scrolls except one, and that book is the book of Esther. The most common fragments in the Dead Sea Scrolls from the Old Testament are Psalms, Deuteronomy, Isaiah, and Genesis. Isaiah is the only book in the Dead Sea Scrolls which is there in its entirety. Everything else is just fragments. About 55% of the documents found in the Dead Sea Scrolls are called parabiblical or apocrypha. These are writings that are from the time that the Old Testament was compiled, but they were not included in the Old Testament. They include things like the Testament of Naphtali, the Testament of Levi, the Aramaic Apocalypse, the Book of Giants, 1st Enoch, Jubilees. A couple of these books are found in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church Testament. 1st Enoch and Jubilees is in that document. But these are works that were written at that time but not included in the Old Testament. And finally, about 20% of the documents in the Dead Sea Scrolls are called sectarian works. They are a collection of hymns, religious rules, scriptural commentary, prayers, lamentations, legal texts. It's a very large, it's 20% of the Dead Sea Scrolls from the period of 47 to 57. The consensus now is that they were not written by the local sect, the Essenes. There is way too much of it to have been written by one small group that lived in the desert next to the caves, which is where they did live. The amount of documents in the Dead Sea Scrolls is so enormous. The sectarian works is by itself so big, could be as big as a library in Mesopotamia or Alexandria. It's not possible that the Essenes created all of it or wrote all of it for themselves. The Dead Sea Scrolls are astonishing for several reasons I've already mentioned. The number of them is enormous. It's about 950 scrolls or fragments of scrolls, which is enormous. They are ancient. They're written from Hellenistic times, 3rd century BCE, to early Roman Empire, 1st century CE. They shed a lot of light on the Old Testament and the times of the Old Testament and the compilation of the Old Testament and who decided to put what in. And they reveal the intellectual life of early Judaism in the Second Temple period. The Second Temple was destroyed in 70 CE, and the centuries before that, not much is known about, but this trove has revealed so much about that time. Also, the parabiblical works, the contemporary works that were not included in the Old Testament, were not considered by scholarly Jews for many centuries as having any particular value, mainly because they were translated by Christians and arose in a Christian setting. And so the Jews of the time, the Jews of the past centuries, didn't think they were important. They thought they were a Christian creation. It turns out they were written by Jews at that time and have much value. So the biggest scandal about the Dead Sea Scrolls was the delay in publishing them. They're discovered in the middle of the 20th century, and a committee is formed by the government of Jordan, which is controlling that area at the time, an international committee to study the scrolls and to publish them. The committee was headed up by a French Catholic priest named Roland de Vaux, and most of the members of the committee, almost all the committee, were Catholic, and many of them were priests. And for more than 40 years, this international committee monopolized the research on the scrolls and published and revealed almost nothing of them. They published some of the Old Testament books because there was no controversy about the fact that these were Old Testament books. We already knew that. 1955, 1961, 1962, they published 3 Old Testament books. After that, there was hardly anything until the late 70s, and even then, not very much. So as time went on, biblical scholars around the world became frustrated and irritated and even angry at the delay in publishing the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1955, a literary critic from the United States, Edmund Wilson, wrote a very long article published in the New Yorker about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Up until then, hardly anyone knew about them except some biblical scholars, and after that, they became more well known. And over time, and over the years, international biblical scholars became pretty angry. The reasons given by the International Committee, headed up by Roland de Vaux and comprised mostly of Catholic priests, was that there were conflicting claims of ownership of the scrolls. At first it was Jordan, and then it was Israel, and then the Six-Day War. Also, the size of the trove was very large. We didn't have enough researchers. Critics felt that the delay was due to the committee's attachment to a particular theory and interpretation of the scrolls, which is that they are pre-Christianity. They talk about messianic apocalyptic groups who are Christian-like. The Essenes were Christian-like. The Essenes were the most important part of the scrolls. The Essenes wrote all of the sectarian works, and they were very attached to interpreting the scrolls in a way that promoted and continued scholarship about Christianity. They ignored the evidence that everything was written by Jews, And they decided that the Essenes were a separate group, not connected to Jews, a precursor to early Christianity. They even speculated that John the Baptist was Essene. So they dominated the discussion. They wouldn't let anybody see them. They wouldn't let anybody photograph them for many, many years. And over time, the frustration grew and grew. They viewed their critics, the committee viewed the critics, they called them fleas. They locked out all international scholars, and then they said every time someone asked to see them, there's nothing we can do. So finally, the whole thing exploded when in 1990 an Israeli journalist interviewed Roland DeVoe's successor, John Strugnell. He was a biblical scholar. I don't think he was a priest. I'm pretty sure he was a Catholic. And in this interview in 1990, Mr. Strugnell starts talking about Judaism, and he says, Judaism is a horrible religion, it's a Christian heresy, and it should be destroyed. Now, it turns out later that Mr. Strugnell had a lot of psychological problems. He was bipolar, he was an alcoholic, it was a bad day. But at that point, the Israel Antiquities Authority said enough. This committee is not going to be in charge of this anymore. The committee tried to hold on for another year, but eventually it just fell apart. And everyone was very relieved to find that the committee was no longer in charge and denying access to the documents. So after that, new people were put in charge. Publications started to happen. They have all been published. They're currently housed in a building attached to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. It's called the Shrine of the Book. It's a beautiful building. It's this white cone like this. It looks like the lid of a pottery, of a piece of pottery from that time. I've been in it, I've seen it, and it's remarkable. Everything's lit up inside. The central shaft of the Shrine of the Book is designed to go down into the earth in the event of an attack on Jerusalem, which could very well happen, and has. So what do the Dead Sea Scrolls teach us? They certainly teach us that the committee, the original International Committee's concentration on the Essenes was misguided. The Essenes are a small part of the scrolls. A large number of the scrolls show the rich life of Judaism at the time, just before the turn of the Common Era. That Christianity was a small thing, it was just starting. There were many groups, apocalyptic, messianic. There was much upheaval. This is when the Roman Empire was in control. There is no direct connection between the Essenes and Christianity. We learn about Judaism of the time, and we learned that the Apocrypha, the parabiblical books, which were historically considered Christian creation, were actually written by Jews and important to study. That's all. Thank you. Questions?
Do you think the Catholics were just trying to protect their religion in some kind of way, because they were nervous about something that was in the Dead Sea Scrolls that would like discredit the whatever, yeah.
I think the original committee was very attached to the idea of the scrolls being evidence of Jesus or the Messiah or Christianity. They were so attached. I don't think they were threatened. They wanted it to come out a certain way. They wanted the story to be a certain story, and they declined to accept or even look at what could be a different story, and in fact, the correct one. I don't think they were threatened.
They did the same thing with the heliocentric version of the solar system. Meaning they wanted to keep the Earth the center of the solar system. And they denied all the evidence, contrary evidence. So I'm saying this is analogous.
Right, and it's not uncommon. The church, the Catholic Church, the Christians, ended up having so much power that they could decide that even physics wasn't real.
I guess I'm curious about the Essene cult as someone who is attempting Buddhist, because I feel like the Essene cult feels like it has some vaguely similar quality to like a Buddhist Sangha, because I feel like, if I remember correctly, I feel like it was like a group of isolated like men who were relatively or fully celibate. Um, I guess I was just kind of curious about any description about the Essene culture. I think, yeah, because I wonder if when people go off into a group and become celibate, if it's an interesting phenomenon to me, because I wonder if it's like a form of like unconscious population control, like people are making themselves like not have children to like if there's like less resources, for instance, some like unconscious signal is passed to them to make them be like celibate. So anyway, that's a little tangential, but I was wondering if you could just describe anything about the Essene cult or.
I think the Essenes were not a cult; they were a sect. I don't think they recruited people and declined to let them leave. That's what I think of a cult. What I know about them, which isn't much, is that they were very introverted, very inward-looking. They were celibate. They did not allow children or women. In my mind, I don't connect that with population control. I connect that with misogyny, or with that of the time that women were considered not as deep, or not as smart, or not as scholarly. It's certainly the times they lived in were dreadful under the Roman boot. And I think that they were not the only ones who wanted to get away from the hard life that was in the towns or cities and create a space for themselves where they felt safe.
Oh, can I just go this way?
I just want to say I actually read recently, and who knows if it's true, but that a motivation for being celibate may have been that it was a Jewish tradition that if you were at war, you had to be celibate. If you were going to be going into battle, no sex. And so that they believed themselves to be in conflict with the Romans, trying to establish the independence of Israel, and that may have been a motivation.
Did you want to comment on that? Anybody else? Joanna, sorry.
I know that in the Christian tradition, there was the Council of Nicaea and perhaps other organizations that decided what was acceptable to go into the Bible and what was ruled out of the canon. Was there any comparable thing in the Jewish religion where they were voting in or out about these pieces of literature?
I'm afraid I don't really know very much about how it was decided which books would be included in the Old Testament and which would not. I don't know if there was a council. I don't think there was. But I can certainly look into it.
Okay. I'll get Vic, then I'll get Artis, because Vic
Can you tell us something about the languages that were in those scrolls? Was it Aramaic and Hebrew, or were there other languages? Or
The languages in the scrolls are Hebrew, Aramaic, and some Greek, but mostly Hebrew.
Were the Essenes vegetarian? I heard that they were.
I'm sorry, I just don't know. They didn't live in a place where you could grow produce very easily, but maybe they did. There were no fish in the Dead Sea, so they did not fish there. So I'm not sure how they were able to survive. They certainly had, I think, like 7 cisterns. They collected water very well. It's possible that they were able to grow their own food and that they were vegetarians.
let me get.
So if I understand correctly, this was the desert that the Essenes were living in. And what was the reason for putting these scrolls in caves? Like, did they go there to, I don't know, get the scrolls to read?
The consensus is that the Essenes did not put the scrolls in the caves. The scrolls were put in the caves by others. We don't know who, and we don't know why. But the Essenes are not connected with the scrolls in hardly any way. The sectarian documents are called that, but it's a misnomer. The sect, when they were first discovered, it was thought that the sectarian documents had to do with the Essenes. But the consensus is that they do not. The Essenes were a very small group, and as I said, the trove is enormous, and it's not possible that the Essenes created that number of documents. The sectarian documents are a variety of things that have to do with life all over that area. So the Essenes may not have had anything to do with the Dead Sea Scrolls at all.
Is there anything in the Dead Sea Scrolls that conflicts greatly with what's in the Old Testament now?
I don't know. I don't think so. As I said, about 25% of the Dead Sea Scrolls are books from the Old Testament, and about 55% are the parabiblical books. That's books that were not included in the Old Testament, but were written at the same time. I'm not sure what's in the parabiblical books. I have not read them. But I do not know, I do not think, but I might be wrong, that there's conflict. The books themselves don't seem to talk about each other at all, at least in the Old Testament. I have read a few, and they tell stories that don't conflict with other books. It isn't a different, it's not, I think it's not, I'm sorry to admit that I've never read the New Testament. I think there are different versions in the New Testament of one story or two. That's not the way the Old Testament works.
I think I'm a little confused because there's the Old Testament, there's the New Testament, there's the term biblical, and there's the Torah, which my understanding was the Torah wasn't formalized pretty much as the Bible wasn't formalized till much later, and that there was just a welter of texts which later became part of this testament and that Torah and everything else. And so the terminology is kind of like a mishmash, and as has been presented here.
I agree, the terminology is a mishmash.
Hank, I guess.
I'm just trying to figure this out. So it sounds like the scrolls were not written by the Essenes, no. So they must have been moved there from some other place. Are there theories that, like where they came from, were they written in Jerusalem and then hidden there for some reason? There must be some kind of theories about why they were there.
I don't know, I didn't get that far into the details. They come from all over, I think. It is not known how they got there or who put them there.
And no idea like why they're there.
Presumably, so they'd be protected from someone, probably the Romans.
Well, thanks so much, Ricky. That was really nice. So, how about we just do like a 1 minute discussion period, or if you have to get up and stretch, and then while Roger comes over and gets ready for his Anglo-Saxon talk. Oh, and I'm going to leave a sign-up sheet on the piano. So if you'd like to hear about the next History Club meeting, which will be the second Wednesday of next month. So if you want to hear about that, I'll leave a sign-up sheet for you on the piano. Thank you. Oh, yeah, sure.
All right. So what I'm talking about is Anglo-Saxon law. That's the focus of this. And I feel like I need to do a little explaining of what an Anglo-Saxon is. I did talk about this a couple months ago here, so some of you were here for that. But I'll just say that we're talking about in the Middle Ages, and we're talking about in England. But what I said last time was definitely an oversimplification because the Anglo-Saxons varied across space and across time. The period of Anglo-Saxon history goes from the fall shortly after the Romans abandoned Britannia, the British island, and so the Anglo-Saxons arrived about 450 AD, and this period extends for 600 years until 1066, when the Norman conquest brought in a new ruling class to what's now England. And so there's a lot of variety over this long period of time in how the law would have been conducted. And also there was variety in the fact that England, the Anglo-Saxons were three different tribes: the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. They all came from the area around Denmark, and they ended up forming into 7 different kingdoms. So lots of variety, different customs, because the Anglo-Saxon law was an unwritten tradition. It was a folk way that would just vary from community to community, from one place to another. And it stretched all the way from the English Channel all the way up north, nearly to Edinburgh. So there's a big chunk of Scotland that was actually also part of the Anglo-Saxon world. The Scots dialect actually was derived from the language of the Angles. The English, where the word English comes from, is from the Angles. One thing then that I would want to say is that the law was a folk tradition, but the Christianity arrived about a century and a half after the Anglo-Saxons. They began to convert around 600 AD. And so this brought with it a new set of law where the church had to have some kind of law protecting it and establishing some new rules. And one thing I just wanted to say is that I think that that the conversion, I think, is interesting because it was for 2 reasons. One, well, you could even say there were 3 possible explanations that come up pretty readily. One is divine intervention. It was a miracle. God intervened in the natural course of events to say, I want to provide salvation to people, and so he made the church triumphant, and that is why Europe became Christian. So that would be one reason. If we're looking for historical reasons, though, I think there are a couple of very apparent reasons for the conversion. One would be that the ruling class found the church helpful in that they were mutually supportive. When the king wanted to have people be loyal and obedient, the church was there saying, be lawful, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, is written in the Gospels as a quote of Jesus, as said earlier this evening. And so there's all that argument that it was politically useful to have Christianity. But I think that that kind of cynical view is one that fails to recognize what I think was the reality for many, many people in converting to Christianity. And that is that conversion provided the converts with security in this life and in the life to come. The faith provided a hope in a future salvation, and it encouraged a level of kindness in society that I think is lacking in the pagan religion that preceded it. The heathen religion of Northern Europe, like most, was not one in which the gods and goddesses were described as being ethical paragons. They were very selfish. They had superpowers, but they weren't loving. And I believe that people were inspired by that message that this conversion to Christianity would be to a new way of living that was kinder and gentler. People were inspired by the legends of the saints that would describe acts of aiding slaves. They were inspired by the self-sacrifice of missionaries. And the sincerity of the conversion is also evidenced by the fact that the Anglo-Saxons sent many missionaries after they had converted back to the continent, back to the Germanic tribes that they had come from, in order to urge their conversion as well, even at risk of martyrdom. And so people really sincerely believed that this was a way to live better. And myself, I think, although I don't consider myself a Christian, I think that I think it's evidence of progress in human society. I think it's evidence that because people know that we want things different, that we can imagine a better world, and sometimes we actually figure out a way to do it. We decide and build institutions that can help us learn to get along better with one another. So that's all kind of an aside from from Anglo-Saxon law per se, but I just think it's interesting, how did this happen that Europe converted? But with that conversion did come in this institution of the church, and kings and other wealthy people gave enormous amounts of wealth, often in the form of land, in order to found new religious institutions, to provide support to these institutions where you'd have a bunch of monks praying, not producing a lot of goods, and so they needed to have land to support them. Several kings abdicated their thrones in order to join monasteries. Many times royal widows would join nunneries, and they didn't have to. They had enough. So here we'll get more specifically into the law of Anglo-Saxons. Women had a pretty relatively strong set of rights under Anglo-Saxon society, under Anglo-Saxon law. There was a bride, when they were married, a bride price would be paid by the groom for the bride. But that money wasn't paid to the father, but to the bride. It became her property. And upon marriage, there was the morning gift, which was given in Germanic societies. Scandinavia had the same tradition, where the morning gift was a gift by the groom given to the bride. And this would become her private property, even to the point that if she died, the money would go to her family of origin. So it was really seen as not communal property, but her private property. So women had the wherewithal that they could find support, even if the marriage ended. If a woman wished to depart from her husband, she would get a share of the communal property. If there were no children, if she left and didn't take any children with her that she'd need to support, then she would get a share equal to that of one of the children. But if she departed with her children, she'd get half the household goods. So it gave women more economic security. It was also illegal to force a woman to marry, and especially if she was a widow. She could have the means of supporting herself. And the church did move over the centuries to make divorce more difficult, because it is Jesus is quoted in the Gospels again as saying there shouldn't be divorce, that men shouldn't be allowed to divorce. And it's thought that he said this because it was often the case that women who were divorced would then be left without any economic support. Okay, and then one more thing on this was that the women, if they were widowed, would inherit a third or even up to half the estate if they were widowed. And this varied with the region, because as I say, there wasn't just one set of Anglo-Saxon law. It was based upon this folk tradition and varied over time. Also, if the families had a lot of property, if they were higher status, then the marriage contract would probably specify who would get the property under various scenarios of being widowed or divorced or anything else. Another thing that I wanted to say is that another change that happened over time was that the Vikings came to England starting about 800. So after 350 years, the Anglo-Saxons found themselves being first raided by the Vikings, and then the Vikings decided it was a better place to be than Scandinavia, and so they settled in almost, basically half of England. The northeast half of England was occupied by the primarily Norwegians and Danes, and the area came to be known as the Danelaw, because the law in that area was the law that the Scandinavians, or the Vikings were familiar with from Scandinavia. They also followed their folk traditions. They're introducing yet more variability to how the law was conducted. So Alfred the Great was able to defeat the Vikings, and a treaty was basically what established the Danelaw, the treaty that Alfred the Great negotiated was one that established a frontier between the two areas, and it also specified that the Viking leadership needed to be baptized. Alfred the Great, I think, was a sincere Christian. He really believed that it would be a great thing if these heathens became Christian, so he served personally as godfather to the leader of the Vikings when he was baptized. And Alfred also did a great deal to promote literacy within his society. He was in communication with Charlemagne, who was his contemporary, Charles the Great, and Charles the Great among the Franks and Alfred the Great among the Britons were both very earnest in their support for the church, giving many resources. And then one other thing that was very important in this treaty that was negotiated was that both the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings would recognize the Weir Guild of the other. The Weir Guild was what I talked about last time, where each person in society has a price, a specific monetary value, where and it's based on your class. And I said last time, as an oversimplification, that the thanes at the top of society were worth exactly 6 times as much as the churls that were the general peasantry, the free men. And that was sometimes true, but there were other scales that were established. One I saw table was quite elaborate. It had like 12 different prices for different classes in society, and several of them were depending upon your position in the church. And the higher you are up in the church, the higher the price was for your Weir Guild. So there was, again, a lot of variety, but the basic concept was something that was pretty common among Germanic tribes. And so the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons could all agree that, yeah, everybody should have a Weir Guild. Everybody should have a price that if you're killed, that's what you're worth, or if you're appearing in court, this is how much your testimony is worth. It's worth whatever your price is, whatever your value is in society. That's how much to count. And they would mathematically calculate how much your testimony was worth based on this. One thing I think is interesting about the Danelaw is that has been described as being an especially free area of Britain, meaning people had more personal liberty there because it was settled by the rank and file of the Danish armies when the Vikings came in. And what that meant was that these warriors each became owners of their piece of land. They were free and independent men, and they had weapons and knew how to use them and would defend their rights. And what that meant was there was a kind of a middle class that was prominent in that part of England. So this is Eastern England. East Anglia is one of the areas today still existing as a section of England. And that's the area that people came from primarily who settled New England. The Massachusetts Bay Colony largely was settled by people from that East Anglia area where Cambridge and Oxford are. So they were more literate, they were a little more affluent than other parts of England, but most especially there was a greater middle class. And I think it's the case that in America in the 21st century, we really would like people, we kind of think, yeah, being middle class is a good thing. We want a society of people who are middle class and can take care of themselves. And that, I believe, is a direct historical result of having this kind of society established in the Danelaw, where it became a cultural norm. So I think that, well, I don't know. I could certainly say some more here, but maybe I'll just, I don't know. Well, let me just say a little bit more, that I think that the legal tradition of the Anglo-Saxons does still pertain today, in that we believe precedent matters in our courts. That's something we got directly from the Anglo-Saxon law, because the idea of precedent is the idea that we're going to follow not a statute that says there's a rule we have to follow. Because if there's a rule that says you have to do something, then it doesn't matter what the precedent is. You don't have to worry about what other cases may have come before. You know, if the rule is you do this, then you just do this. That's the way Roman law worked. It was just a command that this is what you do. The Anglo-Saxon law was developed from precedent, where we say, okay, well, when this happened before, this is what we did. And that is how English law maintained that. Even when the Norman conquest came in, introducing the Roman-style law, there was a merging of the two, and so English law, and hence American law, does have this tradition of where precedent is important. There are several other aspects of Anglo-Saxon law, I think, that still pertain today. The idea of innocent until proven guilty comes from the Anglo-Saxon idea that denial is stronger than accusation. If you deny it, you've got to have some evidence that outweighs it. Just because you have an accusation, that's not enough. If you've got a denial, you've got to find a preponderance of evidence, at least, that you're guilty. So you're innocent until it's been proven. Another thing is having a jury of 12 peers. And another is that even under the folk traditions, they had very strict ideas about legal procedures that had to be followed. And that's something that I think we still have today. If you've ever been in a lawsuit of some kind, man, there are a lot of rules you got to follow. And if you don't follow them, you can automatically lose just because you didn't follow the rules. I guess the last thing I'd say is that the Anglo-Saxons thought that oaths had to be taken very seriously, and they had pretty strict punishment if it was found that your oath was false. They had specific punishments for not being honest in that way, and I think that's something that our legal tradition still has, the idea of perjury. So I'll stop there, I think that was a half hour. Any any questions?
So, do you know what the origin of all these different laws in all these different parts of Britain, it just sort of gradually made more and more laws, or I don't know.
It was, again, the origin was that the every community had its own traditions, and the traditions came from the continent around Denmark, where these tribes, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes originated, and then later the Vikings from Scandinavia. But they all had these. That was the origin of them. That's where they came from originally, and then. Oh, when did it get? Well, prehistory. So they started coming over to Britain in around 450 is the traditional date, and then over about the next century they migrated in and brought with them their traditions from their homeland.
I just wondered how ancient these ideas are.
Oh, as far as how ancient the ideas are, they really just nobody knows. I mean, there's no written record. These were not literate people, so they just had their traditions. Yeah. Another?
I thought that was interesting. You were talking about the value of weirs and churls, and that churls are only 1/6 the value of a weir. But I'm just wondering, what does that mean? Like, if you say kill a weir, does that mean you owe that family like a certain amount of money? That's what it means? Or there's no like execution or torture. You just owe money. Okay.
There were different. Let's see. How can I say this? The church, as one of its efforts to make a kinder, gentler society, urged that capital punishment not be used. They even urged mutilation, physical mutilation, as an alternative to execution, because it was better. Actually they had a very specific idea. Again, its motivation was one of kindness. If you execute somebody, they don't have a chance to repent. And so if you keep them alive, then they have a chance to ultimately gain their salvation. So that was another motivation the church had to try to reduce the number of executions. But yeah, the Weir Guild comes from, like the word werewolf. Weir means man, and the Weir Guild is price or value, so it's the man's price. And the Weir Guild was paid to the family of a man that had been killed as restitution, as payment. And the alternative up to that would have been the vendetta, where they would kill somebody else in that man's family, and then that family kills somebody in your family, and it goes back and forth, and there's no end. There's no resolution. And the church said, well, gosh, let's try to follow this tradition you already have of the Weir Guild in order to allow a more peaceful society. Is that?
Before the Anglo-Saxons came over, the Romans occupied what is now England for 400 years, and Christianity was declared the official religion of the empire by Constantine in the 300 or so. And so there had been a Christian culture in southern England for at least 100 years. I'm wondering what happened to it when the Saxons came over. Were there still remnants of that culture? And were the Welsh and the Cornish part of that Christian culture?
Yes. The chronology was that Britain came in, or rather, the Romans had control from the middle of the 1st century, and the last Roman legion withdrew from Britannia in 410 AD. And so you're right, there was established Christianity for almost 100 years in Britannia under the Romans. When the Romans left, the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes pretty much completely wiped it out. There's very little influence that Rome had on the Anglo-Saxons. They just kind of ignored it, wiped it out. The people that were living there were displaced. They either fled or were killed or were enslaved. The Weir Guild for a Briton, which was kind of synonymous with slave, was the lowest. And you've probably heard of King Arthur. He was actually the remnant of the Celtic Britons who were resisting the advance of the Anglo-Saxons. So King Arthur, there was a historical figure. The evidence is very, very thin, but there was this Roman British leader, Christian, who was resisting the Anglo-Saxons and must have had some battlefield success to temporarily hold them back from the territory he was holding. So the introduction of Christianity to the British Isles is a little complicated because actually the Britons, then St. Patrick came from Roman Britain over to Ireland, converted the Irish, and the Irish actually maintained their church as the church in what's now England was really pretty much wiped out. And so in the British Isles, the Irish church actually dominated for maybe 200 years, and the spread of Christianity among the Anglo-Saxons came with, I think they called him, what do you call him? His name is Augustine, after St. Augustine. He was a missionary sent by the Pope. The Pope saw a slave, I believe, in Rome who he was told was an angle, and he said, "He's not an angle, he's an angel. We have to send a missionary up to save these people." So the spread of Christianity into England began. You've heard of the Archbishop of Canterbury. He's the Archbishop because that was the first church. Well, not exactly the first church, but very, very early church in England, as it then spread northward and ended up being in some conflict with the Irish church that in its isolation developed differently than the Roman Catholic Church. And so there's a whole complicated history of that. But ultimately, Rome ended up dominating. So does that answer your question? Yeah. Any other? Yeah? Okay. It's coming.
I wanted to ask about the Magna Carta and King John. Was that the same one that Robin Hood was fighting? That same King John?
Yeah, what I've read about Robin Hood is that he's, more legendary than historic. I don't think there's any contemporary historic record of Robin Hood. The stories about him came a generation or two later, as I recall. But yeah, he would have been at the time of King John, and the Magna Carta indeed was influenced by Anglo-Saxon law. Actually, I didn't say it, but there was something called my Latin is probably wrong here, but it's something to the effect of Legus Eduardi Confessoris, which were the laws of Edward the Confessor, who was an Anglo-Saxon king around 1050 AD, I think. Before the Norman conquest, he proclaimed a set of laws that were largely based on Anglo-Saxon law, even though they were taking the form of Roman law in saying legislation, that this is the law, this is the law, this is the law. It took the form of Roman law, but it really had the content of Anglo-Saxon law. And it was indeed something that inspired the Magna Carta. One thing I read is that it took on an almost mythical authority, that people looked back at the Anglo-Saxon law as being something that really should be revered. And the coronation oath for centuries contained language that promoted certain, and I don't know the specifics on this, but promoted certain concepts from Anglo-Saxon law of the king not being, there was later the idea of the divine right of kings, that the king was really supreme, whatever he says goes. That's actually not the dominant tradition in England, in English history. The monarchy's been there for something like 1400 years now, and only for a brief period of time was the idea of divine right of kings dominant, basically for about 2 generations, and then they cut off the guy's head because they said, no, we don't like this. Charles I was executed by Cromwell's Puritans. So anyway, the point is that the Anglo-Saxon had the idea of a limited monarchy, and this is actually the norm within Germanic law generally, is that the kings, the monarchs, were not on the style of the god kings of the great empires, but instead they had much more limited powers, and that there was a law that they had to abide to that preceded them and was supreme over them. All right, another.
I'm still fixated on the weir and churl situation. So it just sort of seems like in that situation, like if you're like a rich churl, if you're a rich weir, a rich thane, they're the rich ones. You could basically, if you had a dispute with a couple of churls, you could afford to basically like murder them. Was there ever any kind of like church intercession or public discussion that this was basically unfair? That's a great question.
I think it would be anachronistic to think that there was doubt about the basic foundation of their society, which is that different people had different classes had different value. That was just foundational to their society. I have no doubt that if people were being mistreated, that people would grumble about it and notice it and criticize it. It is also the case, though, that these rural societies were communities where most people would never leave their community. They'd never go 40 miles from home. And everybody knew everybody and kind of knew their place in society. And so, you know, if a Thane wants to go around killing people in the society, it kind of goes against the idea that you're all trying to live together. So I don't know the specifics, and not much is, I haven't read anything specifically about that kind of thing. So, all right.
Great.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Roger. That was really fun hearing about that. I don't know why I like that, just sitting there and listening to all that so much. I know it's interesting. Thanks so much. Thanks so much to everyone for coming tonight. If you want to grab any food on the way out, and we're going to be open for a while. If you want to just hang out and visit, you're welcome to do that. And what else? Yeah, so have a great evening.